Good morning and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. In continuation with the previous session, we shall be discussing the essay The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes. As we have indicated earlier, this is a seminal essay which is located in a transitional phase. This is also considered as an important piece in the understanding of postmodern literary critical practices and also in the understanding of a postmodern shift in the understanding of subject, in the understanding of narrative, and even in the meaning-making process. So continuing our discussion, we begin looking at one of the statements made by Peter Barry in his important work, Beginning Theory. He talks about death of the author in such a way that he locates its importance within a contemporary critical theory. Peter Barry writes, "The death of the author is a rhetorical way of asserting the independence of the literary text and its immunity to the possibility of being unified or limited by any notion of what the author might have intended or crafted into the work. Instead, the essay makes a declaration of radical textual independence. The work is not determined by intention or context. Rather, the text is free by its very nature of all such restraints. Hence, as Barthes says in the essay, the corollary of the death of the author is the worth of the reader." As some of the things that Peter Barry talks about, we shall come back to discuss in detail. And moving on, it's very important to understand the context which produced this essay by Barthes, The Death of the Author. Barthes' essay and his pronouncement of the death of the author needs to be understood within the intellectual life of Paris, especially in the 1960s. So there was a particular move within the European tradition from the 1950s onwards, which placed an overemphasis on the idea and the identity of the author. So we need to understand that Barthes was in certain ways responding to and reacting against such dominant tendencies, and this becomes very important to contextualize the essay The Death of the Author. So in that sense, we can understand this essay as a landmark text in the move from structuralism to post-structuralism. So as we have indicated in one of the earlier sessions, Roland Barthes, when he began his career, he began with a very predominant structuralist mode. But it is with this essay, The Death of the Author, that we begin to see the post-structuralist tendencies emerging from Barthes' works and also his attitude towards criticism, theory, and general, and also most of the things in general. And this essay needs to be read in this transitional context and also as a response to some of the things that were considered more important during those period. And Barthes' essay also needs to be seen as a part of an ongoing battle within the fortress of French literature. And French literature during that time, particularly in the late 50s and 1960s, it was part of a network of ownership and control. So Barthes was in multiple ways responding to these dominant tendencies of that period, particularly in Paris. And even today, when we look at this essay, Death of the Author, we can see that there is a clear stance that Barthes displays against the enclosure of structuralism and the authority of formalism. So in certain ways, we can see a kind of a departure away from the structuralist modes and also away from the formalist modes. If you know the history of critical theory, we also know that in the 40s and 50s, the dominant modes of understanding literary texts were also in connection with the understanding of the author. So in multiple ways, Barthes is challenging this traditional literary critical approach and also foregrounding newer ways of looking at text and the author, and also celebrating the emergence of the reader as a corollary. And whether we agree or not with Barthes, the revolutionary aspect of this text cannot be denied at all, because this is located at such a transitional phase that it becomes a seminal text even in our discussions related to postmodernism, to be able to understand how the intellectual tradition was forged in such a way that the postmodern tendencies also celebrated a radical move away, a radical shift from the traditional understandings of literature and the reading of literature. So though death is usually seen as something not very positive, in this essay we can see that Barthes is using the idea of death, the aspect of death, as an emancipatory event. So here the death of the author does not mark the end of anything, but it only marks the beginning of a new era, beginning of a new kind of new kind of freer and emancipatory reading, in which reader assumes more relevance, reader assumes more significance than that of the author. So having said that, it's also important to stress the fact that Barthes never saw himself as a critic. In fact, he was very uncomfortable with this identification of him as a critic, because he did not assess or provide verdicts on particular literary works. If we look at his the general corpus of his works, we understand that he only interpreted the semiotic significance of works, and more often than not, he did not focus on particular works. He only referred to a general system of works, and semiotic and in analyzing their semiotic significance, he also opened up newer avenues to engage with literary texts. And here it's also important to remember that it was this kind of post-structuralist analysis of literary texts that led to the played a major role in the emergence of various methodologies and techniques within cultural studies. And in various ways, when we look back at Barthes' works, we find that he was not an adherent of traditional literary critical practices, but by challenging those practices, he in fact was opening up newer avenues for us to engage with the literature and culture in general. In continuation with the previous session, where we started looking at some of the particular aspects of the essay, we continue to look at how Barthes locates the significance of the author. And here we also realize that for Barthes, author ceases to be a commonplace, a commonsensical figure. He tries to understand the author as a socially constructed and a historically constituted subject. And here the author ceases to be simply a person, but he becomes a product of history, a product of the societal compulsions as well. And also continuing with his structuralist tendencies, but also places on record that the author does not exist prior to or outside of language. The existence of author, the identification and the idea of the author, it exists only within the structures of language. It's impossible to make sense of an author just as a person outside the systems of language. In that sense, Barthes goes on to suggest that it is not the author who makes the writing, but on the contrary, writing makes an author. So the writing, instead of seeing it as a product of the author, Barthes sees the author being constructed through his writing. Barthes seeing the author assuming an identity of his own, assuming a character and a stature of his own through the kind of writings that he produces. In that sense, from this point of time, from the moment the death of the author, the essay gets published, we find a foregrounding of the text, we find a foregrounding of the reader, and alongside we also find that the author loses the elevated status that he held until that point of time. And in Barthes' own words, the writer can only imitate a gesture that's always antidium, never original. His only power is to combine different kinds of writing, to oppose some by others, so as to never sustain himself by just one of them. If he wants to express himself, at least he should know that the internal thing he claims to translate is itself only a ready-made dictionary whose words can be explained or defined only by other words, and so on ad infinitum. So here Barthes is challenging the very idea of the writer producing original works, and he says that all that the writer does is perhaps combine various kinds of things which were always already available. So it is this combination which makes the writing different or distinct from one another, and it's never dependent on the originality or the genius, as we would say, of the author. So here Barthes is throwing the emphasis away from an all-knowing and unified intending subject as a site of production onto language, and he hopes that through this process, through this critical unpacking of the idea of the author, the idea of the text, he hopes to liberate writing from the despotism of what he calls the work. So here writing becomes the central factor, Rather than the work or the book or the text as we would call it, writing becomes the central aspect with which the reader engages. So the ultimate communication is between the writing, between the text and the reader, and the author loses his significance entirely in this sort of an analysis. And when Barthes talks about death, his death is not directed at the idea of writing. He does not mean that the writing will come to an end, or that he does not try to dismiss the process of writing altogether. But on the contrary, he uses the term death to address specifically this French image of auteur, and that's the French word for author, as a creative genius expressing an inner vision. So by attributing certain particular and specific traits to the author of having originality, of having genius, there is also a sense of power being bestowed upon the author. So Barthes is in fact reacting against those sorts of attributions to the author. And he is also opposing a view of text as expressing a distinct personality of the author. Because in Barthes' analysis, the text need not, and perhaps may not at all, reflect the personality of the author. So it is a completely futile attempt, according to Barthes, to try and look for the personality of the author within a text, and equally futile to hope to be able to understand the text in accordance with the biography of the author. So here, contrary to the popular assumption that authors consciously create masterpieces, we find Barthes totally challenging and even rejecting this idea. In the similar way, he also completely rejects the idea that authors should be interpreted in terms of what they think they are doing. The intention of the author becomes completely irrelevant. It's only the intention and or only the meaning that the reader attributes to the text becomes important at the end of the day. And in Barthes' approach, and when he pronounces the death of the author, the biography of the author ceases to have any relevance. So any kind of biographical or historical criticism completely falls apart when we look at it through the lens of Barthes' essay. And here he is also trying to tell us that the author is perhaps no more important than perhaps a scientist who is doing an experiment. The biography of the author, the personality of the author ceases to be important, just like the details about the personality of the scientist ceases to be important when he is performing a scientific experiment. While we totally admit the revolutionary ideals that this essay was foregrounding, was upholding, we cannot entirely say that the revolution of the essay happened all of a sudden. There is an intellectual tradition attached to it. There is a historical precedence as well. In fact, Barthes' approach, Barthes pronouncing the death of the author could be seen as an extension of the end of the unified subject, as Lacan had done in his rereading of Freud. Barthes was heavily influenced by Lacan's rereading, by Lacan's approaches, and we do find that there is an extension of some of Lacan's views that we find in Barthes' articulation of the death of the author as well. And also, as a corollary, we can even take a look at the Marxist perspective, which understood the author as a very modern invention, just like Barthes does. And it's also, there is a Marxist belief that the idea of the author was derived from the capitalist ideology, and it's also a reflection of the capitalist stress on control through authority. So when Barthes is talking about the author, when Barthes is trying to liberate the author from certain commonsensical understandings, from certain traditional clutches, he is also participating in this in an intellectual tradition which had been exploring the idea of the author, which had been talking about the various ways in which the author could be constructed, the author could be accessed. And here it's also important to remember that the Marxist ideology, just like Barthes and Foucault would later lead us towards, they also believe that the idea of the author was also akin to attaching more importance to an author's person. And in that sense, the author also becomes a part of the wider system of ownership, property and privilege, just like we see even today. And there is also an authoritative interpretation and the presence of a privileged interpreter that we would see when we foreground the presence of the author, when we foreground the dominance of the author. So we find Barthes in multiple ways responding to all of these things, and also drawing from some of those ongoing intellectual traditions and intellectual conversations of the 20th century. And we can also say that a certain kind of a precedence could be found in the stress that the Enlightenment placed on the individual, on individuality. So there is a way in which the author figure underwent particular transitions through these different ideological moves, through these different socio-political movements, and we find that Barthes' essay needs to be accessed, needs to be read and understood in the context of these various historical precedences as well. And there's also this romantic notion of the writer as a creator, writer as a subjective identity. And if you remember, there's a way in which the idea of the author underwent a radical change during the Romantic period, especially with the publication of the preface to Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, where together they looked at the idea of the poet and spoke about the poet as merely as a man who is talking to other men. So there were particular attributes they gave to the poet, but nevertheless we find that there was a radical shift in the idea of understanding the poet. So in this sense, always throughout history we do see that the idea of the author, the sort of attributes that we give to the author had always been changing historically, ideologically. But however, Barthes was the only one who pronounced the death of the author, so that we can look back and trace the intellectual trajectory which led eventually to the death of the author through a series of historical, socio-political and literary and critical changes. So eventually when Barthes talks about the death of the author, what he attempts is to elevate the status of the reader. Until that point of time, the reader was not a significant identity to deal with. And we also find Barthes arguing that, and if a text renders an insightful interpretation, if a text lends itself to a particular kind of an interpretation, it's not because of the genius of the author, but because of the personal experiences of the reader. We also find a certain attributes of the romantic strain also coming in this approach, but nevertheless we can find that rather categorically privileges the reader over the author. And here he even goes on to argue that it is the reader who brings meaning to the text, and in that sense, if it is a reader who brings meaning to the text, there could be multiple readers, and there also exists the possibility of multiple interpretations available. There are no limits to the number of interpretations available, the kind of interpretations available, because we cannot set any limit to the kind of personal experiences that the various readers had gone through. Here the death of the author is not just about the author, but it's also about various other things happening at the same time, the emergence of the author and also the possibility of multiple interpretations. Even today, if we are able to look at to watch a movie and give our own comments, and regardless of what the director of the movie thought about, regardless of what originally a scene intended, this is also because we had been given this freedom to interpret the text in whichever way we want. And here we also may remember that the various platforms which have been opened up today, the various social media platforms today, also celebrate this idea of multiplicity and plurality to such an extent that every reader, every single subject is capable of providing their own interpretation to not just text but also to various situations in the contemporary all around us. Perhaps the most significant example that would come to our mind would be Tristram Shandy, the novel by Laurence Sterne. And here there's a character, a widow wardman, and in order to talk about the character, Laurence Sterne feels that he's incapable of describing the character, and so he leaves a blank page for the reader to fill in their own ideal description of the most concupiscible woman in the world. So here's how the text looks like. He leaves an entire page with an invitation to the reader to fill it in. To conceive this right, call for pen and ink. Here's a paper ready to your hand. Sit down, sir. Paint her to your own mind. Yeah. So here is a text from the 17th century which invites the reader to to participate in the production of the writing. Here's an author who is willing to go to the background and give the freedom to the reader to co-participate in the creation of a text. And there's also Jean Foule's novel French Lieutenant's Woman, where the author, when he talks about this particular character, Sarah Woodruff, he says that the character is an enigma that he cannot know, and he also moves away from the stance of an omniscient, omnipotent narrator and confesses to the reader that he does not know anything more than the reader knows by now. So there are these instances that we can find in literary texts challenging the idea of the author and foregrounding and giving a sort of a freer hand to the interpretation and to the imagination of the reader. And Barthes' essay, in multiple ways, it consolidates all of these events. It consolidates many of these approaches and gives it within a theoretical critical framework. And when we talk about Barthes' approach, we may also note certain similarities with the Yale School of Deconstructionist critics who were popular in the 1970s. There were 4 of them who made this particular school extremely popular during the 1970s: Paul Deman, Hillis Miller, Harold Bloom and Jeffrey Hartman. And they also insisted upon the disjointed nature of text, their fissures of meaning and their incongruities, interruptions and breaks. We find Barthes' essay having a lot of similarity with these critics who emerged in the 1970s. And just like Barthes, the Yale School of Deconstructionist critics also believe that it's not the origin but the destination that mattered more. There have also been alternative readings about Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author. Some have even tried to read this essay as a satire upon the very notions that Barthes advocates in the text. Actually, some have argued that Barthes is perhaps defending the traditional notions of authorship in a very satirical way, but this sort of an approach has only been accepted by a critical minority, and most of the leading critics, most of the leading theorists have not really subscribed to this view that Barthes actually was presenting this essay as a satire. Now, trying to highlight the intentions of the essay The Death of the Author, we have also pointed out that there is a transition that happens in the understanding of the text and also in the sort of privileges that are being attributed to the author. In Barthes' own words, to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. However, by refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text and the world as text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix a meaning is in the end to refuse God and his hypostasis, reason, science, the law. So here, when Barthes is trying to liberate the text from the author, he is also trying to liberate the text from the limits which had been imposed upon it by various external aspects. It could be dominant critical practices, it could be the ideas of reason and science, it could be the methods of reading, that could be the methods of criticism. So here Barthes is embarking upon a task to liberate the text from the author, the figure whom Barthes understands as being extremely authoritative and also not allowing any other possible interpretations. And this refusal to assign one particular meaning to a text, Barthes argues, would eventually lead to the emergence of freer and multiple meanings and the emergence of a celebration of a plurality. And if you look at the way in which Barthes has structured this essay, he begins by addressing a problem in traditional critical approach to literature. And he also asks this question: how can one detect precisely what the writer intended? And most of his arguments in this essay, we can see that they are all directed against particular schools of literary criticisms that seek to uncover the author's meaning as a hidden referent. And also there is an attempt to entirely reject the journey seeking the final meaning of the text, because Barthes argues that there is absolutely no final meaning for a text. It's only the various meanings that particular readers would assign to it. Barthes begins his essay with an epigraph that's about Balzac's story Sarrasine. If we try to read the essay, The Death of the Author, which is also a very short piece, just about 5 or 6 pages, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the original before we continue with the discussions as well. So Barthes begins with an epigraph where he talks about a story by Balzac, which is Saracen. And here Barthes begins this discussion about a castrato disguised as a woman who writes one particular sentence. I'll read it out for you. It was woman with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring and her delicious delicacy of feeling. And looking at this sentence written by Balzac in this story Saracen, Barthes now asks a series of questions. Who is speaking in this way? Is it the story's hero, concerned to ignore the castrato concealed beneath the woman? Is it the man Balzac, endured by his personal experience with the philosophy of woman? Is it the author Balzac, professing certain literary ideas of femininity? Is it universal wisdom or romantic psychology? And then he says, it will always be impossible to know. So here, Barthes talks about multiple possibilities when he tries to discern the voice which is uttering that sentence. It could be the character, it could be a particular philosophy which influenced the author, and one wouldn't even know whether it's a philosophy that influenced the character or the author. And Barthes also tells us right on our face, right at the outset of the essay, that it will always be impossible to know. And in certain ways we can say that Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, is also an engagement with this impossibility to know. And what makes it more postmodern in certain ways is that Barthes does not make an attempt to know. Rather, he celebrates this impossibility to know. And here is where we find also a radical difference that we noticed earlier in our discussions as well, from modernism to postmodernism. Rather than lamenting the fact that it is impossible to know whose voice it is, whose literary voice it is, Barthes is here inviting us to be a part of this exercise of celebrating the impossibility of knowing, because within the impossibility of knowing lies the many possibilities of plural and multiple interpretations. Within this impossibility also lies the liberating effect of giving voice to the voices that were hitherto unheard of. And also within this impossibility of knowing lies a certain kind of a liberation for the reader who's not constrained within particular aspects of reading or within particular methods of reading. And he goes on to talk about this impossibility to know, and he says, for the good reason that all writing is itself this special voice consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. So in the beginning of the essay, in this epigraph itself, Barthes pronounces that the very identity of the body that writes is lost in this entire process. So he begins by talking about the death of the author, which takes place even as the process of writing is completed. And here it's also interesting to note that Barthes does not romanticize the idea of the author. Instead, he only looks at the author as a body that writes. And this epigraph is important to set the tone, to set the stage for the discussions that are to follow. To sum up, in the opening of the essay, Barthes begins by asking this question about Balzac's story, who is speaking in this way. He talks about the many possibilities that are inherent in any traditional literary critical approaches, and then he highlights and rather asserts the fact that it is impossible to know, which also remains as a key for understanding any postmodern text. And he also asserts that we cannot assign a specific origin because it is impossible for us to know, and also identifying a specific origin would also mean that one would not be able to pursue the various other kinds of meaning which are being made possible by the text. And then he also talks about how every subject escapes, all identity is lost, including the very identity of the body that writes. So Barthes begins this essay with this note that there is no point trying to identify the voice. There is no point in trying to locate the identity of the author, because in this practice of writing, in this practice of literature, every subject, all identity, including the identity of the body that writes, is immaterial, and it ceases to exist because it does not really help like we thought it would in the meaning making process. So with this, we come to an end of today's lecture. In the next session, we shall be taking a further detailed and closer look at the entire essay. I would also strongly encourage you to take a look at the original essay and also be familiar with it, so that it would make more sense to you as and when we discuss it step by step in the next session. Before we wind up, it's also important to remember that though this text was written during a transitional phase from the structuralist mode towards the post-structuralist practices, now it has become an important text in understanding literature, culture, and even the contemporary, which is entirely devoid of this author figure, which is entirely about multiple interpretations and pluralities. So this text in multiple ways continues to be seminal in our understanding of postmodern literature, in our understanding of postmodern critical practices, and in our understanding of how the idea of the text, how the idea of the author, and also how the emergence of the reader becomes extremely significant in understanding postmodernism in literature. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.